This It's On moment is brought to you by On Nicotine Pouches.
If you're just tuning in, we're on the first tee at Fairway Links, and Spencer is up last.
Steve, he's got to be feeling the heat. Everyone's had a monster drive so far.
No doubt, Sue. A hush falls over the foursome as Spencer brings his club back.
Oh, Steve, it looks like it's on.
Products for tobacco consumers 21 years of age or older. Warning, this product contains nicotine. Nicotine is an addictive chemical.
911, what's the nature of your emergency?
Welcome back to the Tactical Living Podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Walton, joined by Sergeant Walton. Glenn, how are you?
I'm good.
First of all, I'm going to drop the link to the information that we're going to be talking about. It's very sensitive because we are going to be discussing officer suicide today. And I've been thinking a lot about this, and I think I remember talking to you about this as long as 6 months ago, Clint, where I was wondering, I don't remember what department it was, but there was several officer suicides back to back to back in a short amount of time. And I was thinking about how, number one, in your entire career, you've been very fortunate to not have had experienced this with any of the officers that you work with, especially being at the same police department. And I was really curious to know if there's any kind of correlation between leadership and stressors in admin and officer suicide. And the reason for that is because the number one complaint that I get with my clients or in our Facebook group is admin. It's always admin. It's not the public, although like the whole George Floyd thing was kind of unique. But it's always something to do with admin. Very rarely is it coworkers. It's always something that pertains to, oh, well, the good old boy got the position that I applied for, or admin just paper pushes all day long, and then they're telling me to implement something in a different way, and they don't understand that this is an officer safety risk, or things like that. Very, very valid points. And so what I did is I was doing some research, and then I sent you a one sheet that I put together that kind of explains that there are some solid studies that have been done on how organizational leadership and those types of stressors like low support, unfair treatment, dysfunctional supervision, poor resources are strongly associated with suicidal ideation, things like hopelessness, depression, burnout in officers. And this was a controlled study, and it's very in-depth, and I encourage you to go on and to check out the link that I put in the show notes, because it's very interesting, and I think that it's something that we need to speak very loudly about, because this isn't something that is trained on. This isn't something that people want to talk about. This is the type of thing that typically you have admin that's so high up on their horse that they wouldn't dare consider sharing this type of information because they might be the problem.
Yeah, and when we were talking about this, I started really like thinking about my career and the different dynamics associated to the having issues or not having issues. And when you really start breaking it down, and like, everyone correlates, trauma and PTSD and all associated to someone having those ideations, and that's a factor. I think there's always going to be a factor to it. But going out in the field and seeing the bad stuff that we see and dealing with those bad incidents, like, I think it's one of those things, like, I think most of us in our minds are like, okay, well, I know this is what I'm going into. I know this is what my career is based upon. But when you expect people to kind of screw you over out in the field, but when you come home to your department, and if they're doing the same thing to you, it hits different. And it creates you to have that mindset of, well, where am I safe at if I can't even come back to my department and they're screwing me over, as well as the public, when that's like your safe space.
Yeah, it's the deadly cocktail, I think, of having to respond to traumatic call after traumatic call throughout the duration of your career or even the duration of your day, and then having to deal with toxic admin. It's quite different when you have supportive admin and therapeutic practices in place at your police department where something traumatic does take place. Let's say that it's not in the community, but within your own police department, like an officer-involved suicide. And then you come back to your department and you either have that support or you don't have that support. That's what makes the difference between that deadly cocktail.
Yeah, and I think we let too much of our own personal opinions and feelings and friendships, shine over anything else compared to that hard work, compared to if you're dealing with a traumatic incident and you don't have support. Because I can think of people that, they say, well, you can't control it. What didn't happen to you, and I don't care if you were friends with him or not. Just rub some dirt on it and continue on. Well, that's okay, and that's how it used to be back in the day, and that's how you were raised as an administrator in your department. But that dynamic has shifted to where a lot of the younger generation that's coming up can't deal with that.
Yeah, and I'm going to share how officer suicides or officer deaths, period, kind of impact me mentally and what my mental cycle is like. And maybe you can do the same and we can kind of compare them. But for me, when I see something like a tragedy happen and a police officer dies, in my head, the first thing you do as a police wife is you internalize that and you start to go through the what ifs, right? And I have a very creative imagination. So unfortunately, that leads to my thoughts going to like where I would be sitting when I get that knock on the door, who I would have to say, like, what the fuck are you doing at my department? Name an officer that I am familiar with. And I go through those motions mentally and we internalize that because it hits harder when it's a police officer for you and for your family, because you start to go over the fact that all they were doing was doing their job, and my spouse goes to work doing their job every single day too.
Yeah, and I think for me, like visualizing instances like that, like I've been through some hard incidents within our department where we've lost officers in the line of duty, and it's never something, of course, anyone wants to deal with or handle, but it's on the back end of how do you deal with that? How is it going to impact you long term? I know people in specific instances that they've never dealt with the trauma or the grieving process associated to it, and they've just put a Band-Aid on it, and they keep putting Band-Aids on this arterial bleed, and it just gets worse and worse, and you can see their energy shift happen, go downhill over time.
When it comes to officer involved suicide, something that I'm seeing that's becoming weaker and weaker is this sort of cultural barrier from the OG officers to the more millennial officers, and the touchy-feely versus the rub dirt on it type. And, I think it's a very healthy thing, because when you have this sort of unspoken pain, then it's going to turn into unprocessed trauma. And I think that it's really something to highlight as to how important it is to have that vulnerability, to be okay with sharing that vulnerability, and then to be accepting if somebody else needs to share it with you.
Yeah, and I think it's important to create those settings to where you can be able to address it for both, all generations, because just because it doesn't affect me the same way that it would affect someone else doesn't mean there's a catch-all and that's how it should be done. Like, there should be a foundational base, and this is how we're going to always attack those things. I don't think, like, looking at my department internally, like, we've been very fortunate and not had to have dealt with something like this for a very long time. If say something like that happened tomorrow, we would be scrambling and figuring out, okay, what are we doing next? How are we going to support our members? How are we going to support our department and employees in this dynamic? Or are we just going to shelve it out to say, hey, come in, help us, and that's it?
Yeah, and when it comes to having a suicide at your police department, I think that you're right. It does have this ripple effect on the entire department and families, and trust and morale and camaraderie are totally shaken up. And you have this prime responsibility when you do work with admin, or even when you're being a colleague, a partner, a friend to the people that you work with. And it's a prime time to understand that you have this dual weight of personal grief and professional responsibility, and to be human and to be vulnerable. And it's during those times that I think true leadership has the opportunity to shine through and to show up in the way that you just said, because your first thought was like, how would we support our officers? That shows leadership. And I do highly encourage, with the wellness program at the very least, to incorporate something like that, because it's the type of thing that it's a beautiful thing that you haven't had to deal with that your entire career. However, the last thing you want to do in a case of trauma like this is to have to scramble. And I think too that a lot of people might suffer from things like survivor's guilt, for example, asking questions like, what could I have done? And also kind of reflecting back on conversations with that person. Like, there's so much that happens mentally, because this is very traumatic when you go to work one day and your partner's there, and then you show up the next and they're not, because they decided to take things into their own hands. And then it's hard because there could have possibly been things that could have been done. One would never know for sure, but the best thing that we can do is to prepare for it as much as we can.
Yeah, it's having that foundation set and having those hard conversations with people who have control over that, and to be able to affect change and create a dynamic. And it's not a comfortable conversation to have, but once you set a plan in place, it's just like going to a call for service. You're going over different scenarios in your head as you're going to it. Why aren't we working at this before it happens instead of waiting for the knee-jerk reaction after?
I hope you've gotten some value out of today's episode. If you have, do us a favor, drop a review, subscribe down below, and as always, know that I'm sending you a long, tight hug from my home to yours.